What happens to a superpower when its own people stop trusting it with their money? Right now, across Russia, something strange is happening. Banks are emptying, gas stations are running dry, and millions of ordinary people are quietly turning against the very government they use to fear the most. Before we go any further, hit that like button, tap subscribe, and send this video to someone who still thinks Russia's economy is untouchable, because by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly why that belief is falling apart, piece by piece. For years, the Kremlin sold a simple story to its own people. The war was far away. It was happening on someone else's land, fought by someone else's sons, paid for with someone else's future. Moscow was safe. The system was strong. Life would go on almost as normal as long as you did not ask too many questions. That story worked for a long time. State television showed victories. Officials spoke with total confidence. Ordinary Russians in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, in the quiet towns, scattered across 11 time zones, could switch off the news and pretend the war was happening somewhere else, to somebody else. For most people, the conflict was something they watched, not something they lived. But stories built on distance only survive as long as the distance holds. And in 2026, that distance quietly collapsed. Drones started appearing over Moscow, not once, not as a rare accident, but again and again, forcing airports to shut down and forcing air defense systems onto rooftops in the capital itself. This is a city that had not felt real danger since the Second World War, a city that state propaganda called untouchable for decades. Suddenly, sirens were going off in neighborhoods where people had never once worried about war reaching their doorstep. Think about what that does to a person's mind. For years, you are told your country is powerful, that your leaders have everything under control, that the war will never touch you personally. Then one night, you hear an explosion somewhere in the distance. You see anti-aircraft equipment being installed near government buildings close to where you live. You realize the sky above your own home is no longer something you can take for granted. That is not just a military event. That is a psychological one, and psychological wounds cut deeper and last longer than most physical damage ever could. Major airports like Vnukovo and Domodedovo reportedly had to close their runways multiple times because of airspace violations. Flights were delayed, canceled, rerouted without warning. For business travelers, for families visiting relatives, for anyone who simply needed to get somewhere on time, the disruption slowly became routine. And with every closure, an unspoken message grew louder in people's minds. The state that promised protection cannot even guarantee you a simple flight home. Meanwhile, rumors spread that the wealthy elite were quietly reinforcing private shelters and securing their own personal safety, while ordinary citizens were left to figure things out for themselves. Whether every single rumor was completely accurate almost did not matter anymore. What mattered was the feeling it created, a growing, uncomfortable sense that there were now two Russias, one protected, one exposed, and left to fend for itself. This is where the real story truly begins, because a government can survive military setbacks. It can survive economic sanctions for a while. When it struggles to survive, long-term, is the moment its own people stop believing the basic promise of safety and order that every government depends on to function. And that break in trust did not stay up in the sky. It came crashing down directly into people's shopping carts, their bank accounts, and their fuel tanks. Let's talk about something most people outside Russia have probably never heard of, but something that touched almost every single Russian household in some way. Wildberries. Wildberries is Russia's largest online retail platform, something like a mix between Amazon and a nationwide delivery network. For tens of millions of Russians, especially in smaller cities and remote regions far away from Moscow, it was not just a convenience, it was survival. After Western retailers pulled out of the country following the invasion, shopping malls closed one after another and store shelves quietly emptied. Wildberries became the lifeline millions of families depended on. Clothes, electronics, baby products, cleaning supplies, household essentials. All of it flowed through one enormous network of warehouses stretching across the country. What most ordinary customers did not know is that this same civilian supply chain was reportedly also being used to move military-related goods. Components used to bypass Western sanctions, drone parts, tactical equipment, all of it reportedly moved alongside ordinary packages, hidden inside a delivery system nobody suspected of playing any role in the war at all. Then, in the summer of 2026, that hidden system became a target. Reports describe more than 20 logistics centers being struck, over 1 million square meters of warehouse space reportedly damaged, with losses estimated close to $12 billion. Massive facilities, like the one in Elektrostal, were left in ruins almost overnight. Now, picture what that actually means for a normal family living far from any battlefield. It is not just about military supply lines being disrupted, though that certainly matters to the war effort. It is about a mother in a small town waiting for baby formula that never arrives. It is about a small shop owner whose entire livelihood depended on stock that just turned to ash in a warehouse fire. It is about a courier who no longer has a job because the building he worked in simply does not exist anymore. Workers reportedly began refusing to show up, afraid they had become targets simply by association with the company. Hundreds of thousands of small sellers who relied on this one platform to earn a living were suddenly staring at empty shelves, canceled orders, and mounting unpaid debts. The company itself is said to be carrying an enormous debt burden, described by some as a financial time bomb sitting right on top of Russia's already fragile banking system. This is the part people often miss about modern warfare. You do not need to bomb a city to break the spirit of its people. You just need to break the ordinary things they depend on every single day without even thinking about it. When a package does not arrive, when a shelf stays empty, when a familiar courier stops showing up, people feel that pain far more directly, far more personally, than they ever feel a headline about a battlefield hundreds of miles away. And once people stop trusting the systems that feed and clothe them, they instinctively start protecting themselves in other ways. That is exactly what began happening to Russia's banks. If you want to understand how deep this crisis really goes, forget the headlines about missiles and front lines for just a moment. Look instead at something much quieter, much more personal. Look at what ordinary Russians started doing with their own hard-earned savings. In just the first 2 weeks of August 2026 alone, reports suggest that billions of dollars in cash were pulled out of Russian banks. Not transferred to another bank, pulled out completely and hidden away. Under mattresses, inside home safes, anywhere that felt safer to people than a bank account controlled by the state. Why would millions of people suddenly do something like that? Because trust had already cracked in a very visible way. When the state seized the assets of a well-known billionaire through a single legal order, ordinary citizens were watching closely. If the government could take a fortune away from someone that powerful and well-connected, what real protection did an average family actually have for their modest life savings? The Kremlin reportedly tried to respond by pushing something called the digital ruble, a state-controlled digital currency designed to track and centralize financial activity across the whole country. On paper, officials framed it as modernization, as progress. In practice, many Russians reportedly saw it as the exact opposite of what they wanted. Instead of giving the state even more visibility into their private finances, many people ran the other way entirely, toward informal cash exchanges, unregulated networks, and cryptocurrency. Anything that felt genuinely outside the reach of a government they no longer fully trusted. Banks themselves began closing their doors, not metaphorically, but literally, city after city. Over 1,000 physical bank branches reportedly shut down across the country in just the first 8 months of 2026, hundreds of them belonging to the country's largest state-backed bank. Long-standing financial infrastructure, the kind of thing people simply assumed would always be there whenever they needed it, was quietly disappearing from entire neighborhoods. At the same time, wealthier Russians who still had money left to move were reportedly sending it abroad in record amounts, described as the highest levels of outbound spending in over a decade. Money was leaving the country just as fast as public trust was leaving the government that was supposed to protect it. This created a brutal, self-reinforcing cycle for the Kremlin. The war machine needs money to keep running. The government needs banks to buy its bonds to help fund ongoing military spending. But the banks are running out of available cash to lend because ordinary people keep pulling their money out. So the government is forced to offer higher and higher returns just to attract buyers for its debt, which pushes borrowing costs up even further, straining the entire system from the inside out. You can raise interest rates as high as you want. You can talk about resilience and strength on state television every single night, but you cannot force people to trust a system once that trust has already been broken. And in Russia today, millions of ordinary citizens have quietly made a very personal decision. They no longer believe their money is genuinely safe in the hands of the state. That decision alone, repeated across an entire nation, becomes its own quiet form of rebellion. No protests filling city squares, no marches down main streets. Just people calmly pulling their savings out from under a government's control, one bank withdrawal at a time, day after day. There's also a slower, less visible pressure building underneath all of this. Russia's central bank has reportedly seen its gold reserves shrink to some of the lowest levels in roughly 6 years. Officially, inflation figures announced on state channels stay in single digits, calm and reassuring. But out in real markets, in actual shops and stalls, the price of basic food staples has reportedly tripled over the past year. Two very different stories are being told at the same time, one on television and one on a receipt in someone's hand at the checkout counter. When people start noticing that gap for themselves, no amount of confident messaging on the evening news can talk them out of what they are seeing with their own eyes every single week. You have made it through the first big part of this story, and honestly, it only gets more revealing from here. If this kind of deep, honest breakdown is exactly what you come to this channel for, do me a quick favor and subscribe right now so you never miss the next one. It genuinely helps this channel keep growing, and it costs you nothing. Now, let's talk about something even more personal than money itself. Fuel. Imagine living inside one of the largest oil and gas producing nations on the entire planet, a country that once threatened to cut off energy supplies to entire regions of Europe during winter. And then imagine not being able to fill up your own car in your own city. That is the strange, almost unbelievable reality many Russians are facing right now. Ukraine's sustained drone strikes on Russian oil refineries have created a fuel shortage that would have sounded completely impossible just a few years ago. According to reports from mid-August 2026, only around 28% of gas stations across the entire country actually had fuel available to sell. In Moscow itself, the capital city, that number reportedly dropped to roughly 20%. In southern regions, closer to the front lines, some areas reportedly had barely 17 or 18% of stations still operating at all. To manage this shortage, authorities reportedly introduced fuel rationing, limiting drivers to a fixed number of liters per vehicle, and rotating access based on license plate numbers on different days of the week. People have reportedly been waiting in line for hours at a time, sometimes described as 10 hours or even longer, just to fill a tank partway before supplies run out completely for the day. Here is what makes this particular crisis so difficult to fix quickly. It is not only about the refineries themselves being physically damaged, it is about everything that comes after that damage. Because of years of accumulated Western sanctions, Russia has struggled badly to access the modern technology and specialized spare parts needed to properly repair advanced refining equipment. A problem that should realistically be temporary instead becomes something much closer to permanent, dragging on month after month with no clear end in sight for ordinary people waiting in those long lines. Now think carefully about the timing of all this. This fuel shortage hit right in the middle of harvest season, one of the most critical periods of the entire year for Russian agriculture. Farmers across the country reportedly could not get enough diesel fuel to run their tractors and combine harvesters. Crops that should have been collected on schedule were instead left sitting in the fields, slowly going to waste. When a nation cannot fuel its own farm equipment during harvest season, the consequences do not stay contained in the countryside. They eventually show up on dinner tables everywhere, in rising food prices, in shortages that are expected to stretch deep into the coming winter months. This is not just an inconvenience for ordinary civilians. It is a serious structural problem for the military itself. Supply trucks moving toward the front lines depend on the exact same fuel network that frustrated civilians are now fighting over at local gas stations. When ordinary people cannot get fuel for their own cars, it is a strong, undeniable signal that the entire system supporting the war effort is under real growing strain from every direction. People who filmed themselves complaining about these shortages on social media reportedly faced fines or detentions in some cases, which sent its own powerful message throughout the country. Instead of directly addressing public frustration, the response in some instances was simply to punish the people expressing it out loud. For a government that built its entire national identity around energy strength and self-sufficiency, watching its own citizens struggle just to buy gasoline is not only an economic embarrassment, it is a direct, undeniable hit to the very story the Kremlin has told about itself for decades. Here's a quick pause before we go further, because this next part of the story might be the most personal one yet. If you have not already, drop a like on this video right now. It genuinely helps more people discover this channel and understand what is really happening beneath the surface of this war. Now, when banks are closing, savings are disappearing, and cars are sitting empty because there is simply no fuel to buy, something else starts creeping quietly into people's minds. Fear of what comes next. And for millions of Russian families right now, that fear has a very specific, very personal name: mobilization. After years of heavy, sustained losses on the front lines, recruitment through willing volunteers alone has not been nearly enough to keep up with the constant demand for more soldiers. Estimates from independent research groups suggest Russian military casualties and wounded since the war began have climbed into the millions. That kind of enormous, sustained loss cannot be quietly absorbed forever without consequences. At some point, a country either finds a way to attract more willing volunteers, or it is forced to compel people to go instead. Reports suggest the government has resorted to increasingly desperate recruitment methods, including reportedly offering debt forgiveness to citizens struggling with bank loans or facing bankruptcy in exchange for agreeing to join the military. Think carefully about what that actually says about the state of things. Financial desperation is being used as a direct recruitment tool. People who are already drowning in debt are reportedly being offered a way out that involves risking their lives on the front line in exchange for a clean financial slate. It is no real surprise then that searches related to leaving the country and avoiding mobilization reportedly spiked dramatically in the middle of 2026, reaching levels not seen since the very first wave of panic back in 2022. Millions of searches for the word mobilization itself paint a vivid picture of a population quietly bracing for something they desperately hope will not happen to them or the people they love. What makes this new wave of fear genuinely different from the first one back in 2022 is exactly who is trying to leave. Back then it was largely journalists, activists, and tech workers heading for the exits, people with international connections and remote job skills. Today, reports suggest the people quietly planning their escape routes now include ordinary factory workers, government employees, small business owners, engineers, doctors, and young professionals just starting their careers. These are the very people any country desperately needs to keep its economy and infrastructure functioning properly for decades to come. If that particular trend continues unchecked, Russia is not just losing soldiers on a distant battlefield. It is quietly losing the skilled workforce that would normally be responsible for rebuilding the country after the war eventually ends. That kind of deep structural loss does not heal in a year or two. It can take an entire generation or more to recover from a mass departure of doctors, engineers, and skilled young workers, especially when the country's birth rate and population growth were already struggling badly before the war even began in the first place. Polling data from mid-2026 reportedly showed public trust in President Putin dropping to some of its lowest recorded levels since the war first started, sitting around 69% according to one widely cited survey. That number might still sound relatively high to outside observers, but inside a political system built almost entirely on the image of near total public support and unity, any visible crack in that image matters enormously. It tells you that people are now willing to admit, even quietly, even to an anonymous pollster over the phone, that their confidence in the leadership has genuinely been shaken. Here is the deeper truth running underneath everything we have just walked through together. None of this looks like a traditional dramatic collapse. There are no tanks rolling through the streets of Moscow. There is no sudden uprising filling Red Square with angry crowds. Instead, this is something much slower and, in some very real ways, far more powerful and far harder to reverse. It is millions of individual, quiet decisions, each one small on its own, gradually adding up to something enormous and unstoppable. A person quietly pulling their life savings out of a bank. A family secretly researching how to move abroad before it becomes too late. A farmer helplessly watching crops slowly rot in the field because there is no diesel left for the tractor. A courier who simply stops showing up for work because there is no longer a job waiting for him. None of these individual people are storming a government building with signs and slogans. They are simply quietly, steadily withdrawing their trust and their daily participation from a system that has stopped feeling safe, stable, or reliable to them. This is exactly what real psychological warfare looks like in the modern world. It is not only about explosions and dramatic headlines flashing across a screen. It is about carefully targeting the everyday, invisible structures an entire society depends on: banking, logistics, fuel, basic food supply, until the population itself slowly starts to question whether the government can genuinely protect them at all anymore. Once that quiet, uncomfortable question takes root in enough minds across an entire country, no amount of confident state television propaganda can fully erase it again. Fear can keep people quiet for a surprisingly long time. It can keep them off the streets, keep them from organizing loud protests, keep them silently going through their daily routines, even as everything around them slowly feels less stable and less certain. But fear and genuine loyalty are never quite the same thing. A government that survives only through fear is standing on a foundation that can crack the moment that fear starts to lose its grip on people, or the moment enough individuals quietly decide the risk of staying silent has finally become greater than the risk of speaking up. Right now, across Russia, ordinary people are not risking their lives to fight the system directly out in the open. They are doing something far quieter instead, and in its own subtle way, just as powerful and just as meaningful. They are refusing to keep feeding the system their trust and their cooperation. Every empty bank branch, every long line at an empty gas station, every family quietly packing up their belongings to leave, becomes a small, personal act of resistance that slowly adds up to something the Kremlin genuinely cannot easily control, predict, or reverse through force alone. History has shown us again and again across very different countries and very different centuries that no government, no matter how powerful and unshakable it appears on the surface, can survive forever once its own people fundamentally stop believing in it. Damaged buildings can eventually be rebuilt. Depleted armies can eventually be reinforced with new recruits. But trust, once it has been broken this deeply, this widely, across an entire population of millions of people, becomes one of the hardest and slowest things in the world to ever fully win back again. Think about the sheer scale of what is quietly unfolding here. This is not one isolated problem the Kremlin can patch up and move past. It is 4 separate pressures: financial, logistical, energy-related, and demographic, all hitting the same tired population at exactly the same time. A family dealing with a closed bank branch is often the same family standing in a fuel line. The farmer losing crops to a lack of diesel is often the same person whose adult children are now quietly researching how to leave the country. These pressures do not stay separate in real life. They pile up inside the same households, the same streets, the same exhausted communities, night after night. And that is precisely why this moment feels different from earlier chapters of the war. Sanctions alone were absorbed for years. Battlefield setbacks were explained away on television for years. But you cannot easily explain away an empty bank branch someone walks past every morning. You cannot talk someone out of an empty gas tank. You cannot convince a farmer that his rotting crop is actually a sign of strength. At some point, lived experience simply becomes louder than any broadcast. So here is the real question, genuinely worth sitting with for a moment. If Russia's own people are already quietly pulling away, their hard-earned savings, their daily labor, their basic faith in the future, how much longer can any government realistically hold onto real power when that power is built on nothing but fear alone? What do you honestly think happens next inside Russia? Do you believe this quiet economic rebellion eventually forces some kind of real political change? Or does the system somehow find a way to hold on indefinitely through pure control and repression? Type your honest thoughts down in the comments below, because we genuinely read every single one of them. And if this video helped you understand what is really happening beneath the surface of this war, do us one last favor, make sure you're subscribed, because there's a lot more of this story still waiting to be told.